In this lecture, we'll be looking at Chapter 13, New Directions, a partial overview. So by the late 1970s, a reaction against pluralism, which is multiple ideas, multiple groups, so reactions against pluralism, and women and minorities was evident within dominant institutions and discourse of the art world in the United States, Britain, and many parts of Europe. Resistance to women's rights had acquired social and political acceptability during the conservative years of the leaders such as Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. The rise of the moral majority in the United States, the education reform bill in Britain, the influence of queer theory and cultural studies, the increasing bitterness of the abortion rights debates, and worldwide spread of AIDS epidemic all contributed to changes in the social climate that profoundly affected women. Although some American women artists achieved superstar status in the early 1980s, they tended to do so in work in which gender was not isolated as an issue. At the same time, exhibitions celebrating the return to painting and focusing on a new generation of male neo-expressionists were remarkable for the exclusion of virtually all women. Shifts in emphasis also became clear within feminism as the collaborative and activist politics of the 1970s gave way to the institutionalizing of gender studies within American academic structures during the 1980s and the influences of European psychoanalytically based theories on sexual difference. In 1995, American cultural historian Janet Wolfe infamously stated that there is no correct feminine aesthetic. During the 1980s, some critics more sympathetic to feminism were pointing to the wide range of practices in which women were currently engaged and to the influence of certain kinds of feminist practice in the shaping debates of postmodernism. Feminist critics remained sensitive to the dangers of confusing tokenism with equal representation or the momentary embrace of selective feminist strategies with the ongoing subordination of art by and about women to what is falsely claimed to be the gender-free art of men. Many women artists continue their commitment to political activism into evolving images, materials, and processes that address concerns central to women's experiences and to their personal, sexual, and cultural identities. In this chapter, Chadwick wants to point to a few of the ways that work by women artists is both engaging with and shaping debates around contemporary art world issues. And you're going to see we're going to discuss many of these throughout the chapter. So what I've done in this lecture is mainly I've taken part of these, and then for each one, I tend to focus only on a single artist. And she's going to give you in the text many artists as examples, but for each one, I tend to focus on a single one here. All right, the term postmodernism has been used to characterize the breaking down of the unified, though hardly monolithic, traditions of modernism. From the beginning, feminism in the arts committed to exposing the assumptions underlying many of the beliefs that defined vanguard art engaged in a discussion with modernism. The emergence of a set of critical practices within postmodernism has led to the critiques of the ways the media images position women and how the social apparatus, reinforced by images, cultural myths of power and possession. By the 1980s, it was commonplace of feminist theory to view visual representation as a field divided along gender lines, with an active male artist or spectator opposed to a passive female object. So here we're looking at the work of Barbara Kruger, her date born 1945. Here what we see is her blown up, severely cropped photographs of women, and their short accompanying text subvert the meanings of both image and text in order to destabilize the positioning of woman as object. She emphasizes the way in which language manipulates and undermines the assumption of masculine control over language and viewing, by refusing to complete the cycle of meaning and by shifting pronouns in order to expose the positioning of woman as other. Here we have the artist Cindy Sherman, born 1954, and her photographs reveal the instability of gender and challenge the idea that there might be an innate, unmediated female sexuality. She does this by exposing the fiction of a real woman behind the images that Western culture constructs for our consumption in film and advertising media. This enables her to act out of the psychoanalytical notion of femininity as a masquerade. And although her photographs were always self-images, they never revealed anything about Sherman, the person. So here I just have 3 of her images here, and all 3 of these, all of her works were self-images. So this is Cindy Sherman in all of the works. We also have the artist Sherry Levine, her date born 1947. And she rephotographed and repainted canonical works of modernist art, and she then exhibited them as her own. Now, this raises questions about originality and works of art as property and a culture which experiences much art only through its reproduction. Hers is an act of refusal, of authorship, rejection of notions of self-expression, originality, or subjectivity. Challenges to the modern notions of male authorship, originality, and the autonomy of the art object have become central features of postmodern critical theory. While it is true that feminism, and also gay and lesbian critical theory, share with postmodernism a critique of an earlier model of a unified autonomous master subject and a belief in a re-centered subject, many feminists are critical of postmodernism's assumption of a position of cultural authority, its tendency to nihilism, and its emphasis on theory at the expense of social activism. Together with gay and lesbian theory, feminist theory has continued to challenge conventional assumptions about sexuality and gender, to raise issues of identity, and to engage in debates about ideology, the mass media, and the workings of authority. Recognizing the dangers of a split between theory and activist politics during the 1980s, feminists and gay lesbian activists have employed similar strategies of challenge and disruption. During the 1970s, while white feminists pointed to women's shared experiences under patriarchy, feminists of color and lesbian feminists often took issues with the tendency to collapse female identity into a united and implicitly heterosexual and white, not to mention middle class, category. Growing awareness that the women's movement reflected the dominant voice of white middle-class women led to later investigations into more specific forms of oppression and the processes of differentiation which establish race and gender positions. Now, feminism, or post-feminism, in the 1980s conceptualized both race and sexual orientation as major components of identity politics under the influence of the rise of queer theory. This is a body of writings that often presented sexual orientation as a way of talking about gender. And post-structuralism, with its emphasis on difference rather than universalizing tendencies as the basis of politics. We have the artist Lubinia Himid, born 1954, and she was a British artist. And she argued that cultural appropriations must be placed in a dialogue between cultures in order to displace the relationships of dominance and subservience that have been used as the artifacts of non-Western cultures to prove the superiority of white culture emergences. And she says we can see this in Sonia Boyce's, who she was born in 1962, multi-panel work, Lay Back, Keep Quiet, and Think About What Made Britain So Great, from 1985. Himid and Boyce are two of the British artists from Afro-Caribbean backgrounds who are committed to exposing the reality behind the distortions that pretend to say what it's like to be black and female in a white, male-dominated society. Also, as a series of exhibitions in the United States address the political aspects of multiculturalism by bringing together works that address the ways that identity, including racial, ethnic, or sexual, is imposed, contested, or fantasized. Native American artists have addressed the uneasy meeting of multiple and sometimes opposed cultural geographies within their work. We see this here with Shelley Nero. She was born 1954. She's a Mohawk painter, sculptor, photographer, filmmaker, and self-proclaimed intellectual terrorist. She was raised on the Six Nations Reserve near Brantford, Ontario, Canada. And she uses her photographs to undermine cultural stereotypes. And you see this in the photograph, The Rebel from 1987 here. And what this is it's her mother lounging atop the family car, which was an AMC Rebel. The photograph undermines the stereotypes of both the Indian princess and the Earth Mother, while at the same time also challenging the cultural trope of sexy women selling sexy cars. A number of women in Britain and the United States have adopted deconstructive strategies as a means of exposing the assumptions underlying cultural constructions of gender, race, and sexuality. These artists use racially conscious photos and text and performance work to call into question media-based and visual representations of race and identity. We have the artist Lorna Simpson, born 1960. And her work has been preoccupied with the invisibility of Black women and their erasure from history and from white consciousness. Shifting the focus from racial to sexual identity also, the works of artists use photographs and objects to dismantle the assumed fixalities of sexual identity. So in this slide here, we see Lorna Simpson's Guarded Conditions, and now we're going to switch to Millie Wilson, looking at ideas of sexual identity. Millie Wilson was born 1948, and her project, the Museum of Lesbian Dreams from 1990 to 1992, combines and draws on pseudoscientific and medical discourses on lesbian desire. Her work articulates the historical inaccuracy and often absurdity of social constructions of lesbianism within dominant heterosexual discourses. Such discursive formations often work to fix identity within and outside normative paradigms. The work of significant numbers of women during the 1980s also strenuously resist unmediated expressions of meanings, emphasizing instead ironic commentaries on categories of human knowledge from morphology and metaphysics to sociology and archaeology. Many contemporary women sculptors were also using materials and worked at a scale that defies stereotypical notions of women's art. Rachel Labakowitz, born 1964, parodied the shapes of minimal sculptures and glistening blocks of lipstick. And here, this is one of her lipstick sculptures, and these are actually lipstick urinals. It's called Untitled, but lipstick urinals. Also, treating language as both target and weapon, these and other contemporary artists consciously use it to explore the ways in which that information is socially and culturally coded. In 1985, some artists dealt specifically with the intersection of gender and representation. Refusing the image of woman as sign within the patriarchal order, these artists have chosen to work with an existing repertory of cultural images because they insist feminine sexuality is always constituted in representation and as a representation of difference. And here we see the work of Mary Kelly, born 1941. She's an American artist who lived in London in the 1980s. And she refused the direct representation of women in her work in order to subvert the use of the female image as object and spectacle. Her work emphasized sexuality as an effect of social discourses and institution and stresses the potentially oppressive social-psychological production of sexuality. Later works of hers integrate the ways that women's roles are formed within the family and society. And you can see that in her Corpus 1985, which is seen here. Also during the 1980s, not all women embraced appropriation or media technologies as representational strategies. Women using paint as a medium also found themselves negotiating a complex territory as they continued to look for ways to locate themselves within a tradition where they had been historically discriminated against and which had been defined in male terms. Here we see the work of Ida Applebaum. She was born 1929. Her works links violence and sexuality and associates intimacy with often murderous rage. Her simplified cartoon-like spaces reveal fragmented scenes of domestic spaces in which humanity seems to have run amok and there's little to distinguish the ordinary and the bizarre. Some artists and critics called for more explicit confrontations with issues of the body and intimacy. Other exhibitions articulated self-conscious reactions against the moralistic tone of some 1970s and 1980s feminism in order to reconcile politics with pleasure or to reinsert anger and confrontation as aspects of representation. Although some of this work seemed like a return to the 1970s feminist celebration of the female body and female sexuality, it differed in its insistence that unmediated images of the female body were no longer possible, and its conceptualizing of the female body as radically polymorphous, meaning occurring in several different forms or stages, rather than representable through a unified image or symbol. Louise Bourgeois, 1911 to 2010, who we've looked at before, she has remained at the forefront of explorations of gender, sensibility, and sexuality expressed through images of the body and bodily surrogates seen since the 1940s. And you see here the Arch of Hysteria from 1993. Also, recent representations of the body have also frequently acknowledged its social existence as a political battleground. Also, other women used humor and irony to challenge social constructions of gender. Here we have Helen Chadwick, 1953 to 1996. And here she uses animal skin in works with a fetish obsessive quality. In Glaciola, 1993, which is discarded Russian fox furs, they're arranged like a circular trophy on the large round table. She said, quote, "I wanted to make a work that would play off how you read gender and yet be impossible to define, so that a phallic structure is not simplistically penile and something more supposedly feminine also doesn't quite live up to that stereotyping," unquote. For some women artists, the taboo of intimate themes and sexually explicit images has a subversive edge. Some works attracted controversy in its explicit referencing of pornography's normally hidden imagery. And then women's insistence on defining their own normative social and sexual categories and their refusal to be absorbed into models of white heterosexuality has also led to a number of works that make explicit their lesbian content. And we see that in the work of Nicole Eisenman, who was born in 1963. Her figurative drawings and murals teem with voluptuous sexuality. Her work, U.S. Lesbian Recruitment Center, has been called, quote, "every misogynist and homophobe's worst nightmare," unquote. And the image shown here is her lesbian recruitment booth from 1992. Other narrative strategies of the 1980s and 1990s also used multiple persona and voices, the fusing of fact and fiction, and retellings of history and biography to deconstruct patriarchally based cultural forms. One of the points of connection between current investigations into sexual and cultural differences in earliest feminist explorations continues to be visible in women's choice of autobiography and narrative as structures within which to explore female experience and subjectivity. In 1985 and 86, Faith Ringgold, who we've talked about before, established a powerful voice for Black female artists within the spaces of modernism from which she has previously been excluded, except as a model and a servant. In addition to adopting multiple persona, women artists today are also choosing a variety of public roles. During the 1980s, the National Endowment for the Arts encouraged proposals that integrated art directly into the site and promoted artists' direct participation in all aspects of site selection and planning. However, not all work executed during this time was collaborative or specifically feminist. And here we see the work of Maya Lin, who was born in 1959. And this is the Vietnam Veterans Memorial from 1975. Here, she won the design competition for it while she was actually still a college student at Yale. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial succeeded as no monument before it in calling forth and embodying a culture's conflicted response to its history. Also, we're going to see social and political contexts form the basis for public projects and installations of the Guerrilla Girls. During the 1980s, other artists turned to artwork politics into spaces and practices of the museums as sites for ongoing investigations into the ways that culture is collected, institutionalized, and displayed. And we see that in the work of the Guerrilla Girls. The Guerrilla Girls are a group of activists who work anonymously behind large rubber gorilla masks, and they began installing posters around New York Soho in 1985. And these posters use statistics to target racism and sexism in gallery and museum shows. And you can see that such as the work here and in this work here. Do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? Less than 3% of the artists in the Museum of Modern Art selections are women, but 83% of nudes are female. So although there's little consensus among women at the present time about where to go next, and although many goals of the women's movement have not been met, contemporary art by women reveals the formulation of complex strategy and practices through which they are confronting the exclusions of art history, expanding theoretical knowledge, and promoting social change.